What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Neverwinter Nights. Now, just to get a few things out of the way right at the beginning here, I like to review games after 100% to set me apart from other YouTubers, as well as give me some credibility. My Steam profile is public. You're more than welcome to check it out down in the description below. These reviews do cover much more than just the achievements, obviously, though. And if you check out my channel and you're not subscribed, first thing you'll see is an explanatory video on that subject. But that said, with Neverwinter Nights in particular, I think it's worth mentioning that quantifying 100% in any real capacity for this game is a very difficult task, because if you're unaware, Neverwinter Nights came with a set of tools that allowed users to create their own custom campaigns, as well as online servers, essentially, that served as small little MMOs, often referred to as persistent worlds. And just due to the very nature of that, it can be difficult to look at this and be like, this is 100% of this game. So when I talk about 100% for this, I'm primarily referring to all of the content that comes with the enhanced edition version of the game. And then I did go through and check out some of the extra stuff as well. But again, that stuff is kind of endless if you want it to be. From there, let's actually dive into this thing. So first and foremost, the original Neverwinter Nights was developed by BioWare and was originally set to be published under Interplay. However, Interplay kind of went under during this period and the publisher shifted to Atari. And as a fun little aside, Neverwinter Nights is actually named after another game that also had the name Neverwinter Nights, but was previously released in 1991. And the 1991 release version of Neverwinter Nights actually holds the surprising place of being the very first graphical MMO, which is why they named this one, with all of its multiplayer elements, after that title. But the game itself, regardless of whether or not you're playing the custom campaigns or the default campaigns, etc., is ultimately a third-person action role-playing game. And while I would certainly call it a CRPG, exactly how you want to describe this thing is really up in the air. But basically, third-person action game, and I do emphasize action in a lot of cases, but we'll talk about that here in a bit. And it is set in the Dungeons & Dragons Sword Coast area of the Forgotten Realms setting, which means, of course, that it is based in Dungeons & Dragons. This particular game uses Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, which is important because there is a 3.5 edition, which is what Neverwinter Nights 2 uses. So while in some regards Neverwinter Nights could definitely be considered more of a set of tools to make and play certain campaigns, etc., it nonetheless does have a lot of content that can be divided into a few different means. There are the default campaigns, which are The Wailing Death, which is the base game, and then there were two expansions known as Shadows of the Undrentide and then Hordes of the Underdark. Now, Shadows of the Undrentide and Hordes are actually both the same story. Hordes just continues where Undrentide leaves off. Then there are extras. These are just short little excerpts, really. In some cases, they're not even campaigns. They will let you do things like play as PvP. There's even a chess mode. It'll let you mess around with using more companions than just one, which we'll double back to. Then there is the premium content. These are slightly shorter campaigns that you have to pay individually for. There are 6 of them, and you have to pay a couple extra bucks to use these. See, when the game originally released in 2002, after the expansions, I believe it was in 2004, they opened up an online store where you could buy these premium campaigns, which would add more to the game. And then from there, we of course have the custom content. This will allow players to take on the role of a DM and basically guide a party via multiplayer through a campaign, or use one of the persistent worlds, which are, again, kind of like an early MMO. Now, let's talk character creation a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, this used 3rd edition D&D, but character creation has a few intricacies that I would prefer to talk about instead. So while the 3rd edition stuff is pretty true to form, barbarian, there's multi-classing. If you're familiar with any of my Pathfinder videos, you'll actually kind of get the gist of this, albeit there's not as much of it here. However, they did streamline a lot of it. And by that, I mean they basically just guide you through quick choices for your class, and then they use a couple methods to simply make creating a character easier. And this is done via packages primarily. Packages are a set of pre-configured feats, etc. that a character can take, which is great if you don't know anything about D&D. It can kind of help you make a decent character without really knowing too much about the system itself. And for the people who know what they're doing, they can also customize these to be exactly what they want. Now, on one hand, I think this is great for new players who don't really know the system that well. You can kind of just make a character without knowing too much about it. But on the other hand, the game doesn't really do a great job of ever teaching you anything if you go that route. So while it's great for new players, on one hand, On the other, it doesn't really teach you the system either. So there's no real learning curve because the game just kind of does it for you. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about for character creation was sub-races. A lot of times with this game, it is pointless to talk specifics because what you can't do in one campaign, another custom campaign will let you do. So when it comes to races, these are actually one of the points where that's a thing. So some of the custom campaigns will have race options, etc. available that other campaigns just don't because they don't support them. So when you click sub-race, you'll actually just get a blank text box that you're meant to type into. And basically you'll type in whatever sub-race you're trying to play as, and the campaign will either recognize that as a unique subclass with stat modifiers, etc., or it won't, which in my opinion is a pretty interesting way to handle that. From here, I want to talk about each of the kind of portions of content, as talking about them individually, again, is a bit of a fruitless endeavor in many ways, simply because without just straight up spoiling it, I can't really go into any great depth because from one campaign to the next, this stuff will change. That said, starting with the default campaigns. The base game is kind of blah, but it does get better as you go. So the base game sees you trying to save the city of Neverwinter from the Wailing Death, which is a plague. And while I did like the story and some of the characters, ultimately it kind of falls flat in a lot of places. So starting with the base campaign and all the default stuff, it's incredibly combat heavy. There's very little chances to roleplay in the base campaign, and ultimately they added a lot of filler that's really just combat. It's a 4-chapter campaign, but you really could have cut out like half of the second and third chapter, rolled them into one, and wrapped the story up much faster. A lot of it is just there to pad it out. And again, that padding is basically you just fighting hordes of enemies. And you have to fight them by yourself, because in the base campaign, you can really only have one companion with you, unless you're a mage using like a familiar or something. And then we get to Shadows of Undrentide. Big step up in quality here. The story overall was much better, it's a little snappier, there's not so much filler content, and honestly, it's just a lot more interesting. And then we get to the best part of the base campaign experience, and that is Hordes of the Underdark. Hordes of the Underdark is actually a direct continuation of Shadows of Undrentide, and while it's certainly not perfect, it is heads over tails better than the other two. It will allow you to have multiple companions with you. You can actually make decisions that will affect the story and the outcome, so you can roleplay as well. And there is a lot of combat, but at least you can also roleplay. And the worst part about Hordes of the Underdark is really just that, like the rest of the game, it is aging, and it is starting to show its age. But comparatively speaking, Hordes is a really great experience that honestly stands up mostly pretty well, whereas the other two are definitely a little lackluster overall. But Shadows of Undrentide is much better than the main campaign as well. And then from there we have the extra stuff. This is mostly just like features, really. Like I mentioned, there's like a little PvP arena you can take part in. There's little short stories where they tried some different stuff. There's a chess match one. Interesting overall, but they don't add too much to the overall experience. And then there's the premium stuff if you really want to pay the extra few dollars to check out the premium modules. Ultimately though, I don't get the impression that this was ever particularly popular, and in 2015, they actually shut down the original authentication servers for the premium modules, basically the internet connection required to prove that you had paid for these modules. The original versions of these modules wouldn't even work anymore because that authentication thing didn't work. However, there are quite a few ways around that, and you can buy them again with the enhanced edition and they'd work, but I don't get the impression they were ever very popular. And with them being behind a separate paywall, even if it was just a few bucks, was kind of annoying. And then, of course, we have the multiplayer stuff. Probably the most interesting thing here is, again, the fact that people could get together, make custom campaigns, custom modules, etc. And this is something we've seen incorporated into more recent CRPGs, which makes the fact that this original attempt here was done all the way back in 2002 all the more impressive. This comes with a DM mode that allows somebody to kind of, again, take that tabletop experience into the actual 3D space that we have here, combined with the fact that you could play this online with your friends, and it was a very ambitious thing to do. And then there are the persistent worlds, which, again, kind of like early MMOs. Some of these are actually still going. So the characters or people who are really dedicated to their creations and seeing them thrive and adapt and evolve, absolutely had the tools at their disposal to do that. Now that's kind of an overview of what the game is, really, and I could go on in a lot more depth and give positives and negatives, but here's the thing. A lot of that stuff changes from campaign to campaign. So while I might list positives or negatives for one particular campaign, there's another campaign that might change those things in their entirety. So it's very hard to sum up a game like this in that way. So instead, I'm just going to give you guys a conclusion. Neverwinter Nights is an incredibly ambitious piece of history that I think people should check out. The Enhanced Edition is $20. It looks a little nicer, a lot of the multiplayer stuff has been restored. It never really went away, but you had to jump through some hoops to get it to work. And ultimately, the Enhanced Edition is just a convenient way to check out a very classic game that had a fairly enormous impact on the genre that prior to this point I hadn't really experienced, so I'm very much so glad I went and experienced this for myself, and simply for no other reason than that, I would recommend people check out this game. And honestly, with the wealth of content available, you're likely to find something you enjoy here. Though I do think it's worth a mention that even with the Enhanced Edition, the game is starting to show its age quite a bit. And while for the most part it does still hold up remarkably well, all things considered, keep in mind it's starting to show its age, and there are a lot of newer games that have done these things a bit better. However, I can see why people are so attached to Neverwinter Nights, especially given the time it released all the way back in 2002. It really is a remarkable game for what it is and what it tried to be. And in many ways, it was more of a tool set that gave power to people to make their own campaigns in a D&D-like fashion, which on its face is incredibly cool. But there you go, guys. There is my review of Neverwinter Nights, a very interesting title that I am very glad that I went back and played and added to my gaming history repertoire, shall we say. But regardless of any of that, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.